Sorry, I don't love you. Afraid you've grown accustomed to. Cause with you something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong, something isn't right. I wish you could be happy.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back, as is Katie Schaefer. We are talking all about Venom. So if you have not seen it yet, don't listen to this. Save it for later. We are ready to discuss this, aren't we, Katie?
We are so ready.
One of the first things I want to start off with, and this is something I've been doing for a lot of the movie episodes I've been doing lately, and that's to talk about the casting, because that's sort of the core of your movie outside of the story. And I think the casting is stronger than the story, but I don't think in this movie in particular they use the cast the right way, because you have Tom Hardy as Eddie Brock and Venom, which I think he was probably the strongest cast member in this movie. You have Michelle Williams, Riz Ahmed, and Jenny Slate is in this as well, and then you sort of just have the other supporting characters. But I really feel like they could have used Michelle Williams in a much better way. I felt like most of the time they were like, oh, Eddie's ex this, Eddie's ex that. And I was like, oh, why are you doing this to her?
Right? It was so awful. Like, they just really didn't explore her character at all. It feels like such a waste of time. And it's Michelle Williams. How can you waste Michelle Williams,
They gave her the symbiote for like 5 seconds too. I was like, hold on, no, we need more of this and more of an explanation, please.
Right?
I get why it happened, but it just did not feel very fulfilling. It's like, oh, okay, that's one way to bring the symbiote to Eddie, and that's all we got out of it.
Yes, totally. I felt like, I watched it and I felt a lot of the time, I was like, this is fun, we're going. And then they show that scene with Michelle Williams, and it just feels like such a, it feels so much more about Eddie and Venom than it does about Michelle Williams and Tom Hardy's character.
Right.
And it feels kind of awkward, and but also great at the same time. So there's just so much going on that the movie doesn't really seem to acknowledge.
Right.
It just kind of, it does things, and it seems to be sending a message that this is what it's trying to do. But what it's really doing is entirely different.
Exactly. Plus, it sort of just feels like the women in the movie were a little underserved, because you have Jenny Slate as Dr. Skirth, I believe. I'm really bad with character names. Sometimes I'm like,
right.
hey, the actor who was in that thing, and I can never remember the character names. But she played Dr. Skirth, and she was in it quite a bit for certain scenes, but then she's just dead, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, that was useless.
Right? All of a sudden, she's just gone. Just gone.
I feel like she's way too smart of a character to just kill her off in that way. It makes sense, but I feel like the story could have been better if they went in a different direction. And we are going to go through some of our ideas of how this movie could have been better, because between you and me, I'm sure we have a lot. So
A lot.
Yes. And then, like I said, Tom Hardy was obviously a bright spot in the casting. And it's not that, Michelle Williams and Jenny Slate were bad. It's just how the story utilized them didn't really work for me. And Riz Ahmed was Riz Ahmed. I didn't really care for that casting one way or the other.
And they use him so poorly. I felt like Tom Hardy, like you said, he's the bright spot. And he holds this movie together. Without him, this would have been just trash. Just not even worth your time, energy, or effort. And it wouldn't be making the box office numbers that it is. But everyone else just fades into the background. And any acting skills that they have or don't have don't even matter, because Tom Hardy is the front and center, and they really lean on him to make the movie work, because the editing, just so much about this movie failed. And it could have been better, but I will say I did have a lot of fun watching it.
I feel like it came across that Tom Hardy had a lot of fun filming this, and I think that's why his character worked more than the rest. It's like, okay, you know what? Tom Hardy's having fun, so you could really feel that in the movie.
I agree. Like in the beginning, he's kind of mumbly mouthed and doesn't really, he's not very interesting. But then as soon as Venom comes into the picture, he gets this opportunity to be outrageous and ridiculous and over the top and really plays into that. And I think the biggest thing that impressed me about it is that he doesn't do anything by halves. He didn't phone it in this. He gave it all the effort he did for, Mad Max or The Revenant or whatever. He's always down to give everything 100%. And it works here, even though the material he's given is so bad. So bad.
I feel like the reason I didn't care quite as much about the Riz Ahmed casting is because I am pretty sure there were allegations against him as well, and all of the Me Too movement and everything. So it was one of those things where I was like, all right. I watched The Night Of. I like The Night Of. That was before all of this started coming out. And I just looked it up. I couldn't find too much on it. So I'm not really sure whatever came of that. So it was one of those things where I was kind of sitting there watching it and I was like, do I care that this guy is in the movie? And, obviously there is some diversity within this cast, and we see that even just with some of the more minor characters and everything like that, Eddie's boss briefly and everything. We do see some characters that sort of make you feel like you are in San Francisco, because if you go to San Francisco, it's a very diverse place.
Right, I agree. And they try. And I didn't know that about Riz Ahmed, and that changes my perspective of him.
Like I said, it's something I remember hearing in passing. I don't know whatever came of it, so I'm no expert here, but it was something that was sort of in the back of my mind as I was watching this. And obviously that's going to happen, and I'm not going to fault an entire movie because of one person. I think there are other problems with this movie, quite honestly, and I think a lot of people can agree on that at least.
Right. And that he's given, I felt a lot of the times when I'm watching him, he changes. Every time we see him, he kind of is a different person almost, with different goals. In the beginning, he espouses one perspective. By the end, he's completely gone off the rails. But the progression from one to the other is totally nonsensical. Like it doesn't feel seamless or like thought out. It feels very choppy, as though this script got changed several times and nobody was careful to make it a whole thing, instead of just like, meh, it'll work, it's fine, it's a Venom movie, who cares?
Yeah, since we've talked about sort of the core cast there, I do want to move on to the plot and the plot holes that came with it, because like you said, a bit of this movie is choppy, not just character wise but also with the plot, because it's like, okay, we know Eddie Brock is investigating this dude, investigative journalism, that's his job, and then he just goes and outs Anne as his source and she loses her job. I was like, what? No, that's not, you don't do that.
Right? It was like, you see it happening and you're like, what? This isn't a thing that reporters do. This isn't how journalism works. Like, you would know that the very act of engaging in this would undercut any kind of journalistic integrity that you once had. And it seems he just throws it away, and it defies logic in that aspect.
And it's someone so close to him too. You're like, that does not make any sense. If it was someone he didn't really know, sure, I could see him being pressured into giving up that name, but he's literally living with this girlfriend of his and he just like throws his life away and hers all in one go. And it's like, obviously she's going to be mad about that, but then that's another thing that's a disservice to her character too. It's like, okay, I feel like the best part for her character was when she was taking charge at the end and was like, I can do this, I can fight dirty, and she cranks up the sound and gets the symbiotes to sort of come off of both men as they're fighting. And I was like, yes, why didn't we get more of this throughout the whole movie? And then pretty much the movie's over after that, so it didn't really matter.
Right, exactly. That's totally how I felt. It was like such a wasted character opportunity because you could tell there's more to this woman that they're portraying than they're giving her even a tiny bit of credit for, and they just waste all of that. And it's so weird how he utterly betrays her and drags her name through the mud, because that wouldn't be a tiny deal. As a lawyer, you would be suspect, you might get disbarred. And then he, is going through all his trauma and having all these issues, and she's like, I'm here for you, and my boyfriend is here for you. And that part of it, I was like, okay, but no boyfriend is going to be okay with this. I don't care how much he idolizes, this investigative journalist. He is not going to be okay with taking care of his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend. So it just pushes incredulity so much. And
especially that restaurant scene. I was like, what is going on? And, obviously Tom Hardy plays the part very well, but it's just like the logic behind some of the plot for this movie, it just wasn't there for me. I was like, yes, okay, I get it's a comic book movie, and sometimes there isn't logic behind these fictional things. Like, hey, kid with spider powers, that's not very logical, but it was the stuff that should have been logical that wasn't. And I think that's sort of what bugged me the most about the plot for this. It's like, okay, yeah, the whole part with, Venom attaching himself to Eddie and everything, I was like, that's believable, because he went into the lab, and that's something that could easily happen, especially with the alarm going off and all of this other stuff happening at the same time. And then you have these things that are so realistic that make no sense. You're like, that's not how this works in real life, and these are real life events that could happen.
Right, it kind of rides that in-between world of like Marvel, where everything is kind of very heightened and fantastic, if you will, and DC, which is this gritty, super dark world. And then in between, Venom kind of tries to ride that train, and it's only middling successful. Like, I just felt throughout it, the logic is happening. I was like, okay, we're doing this now, and now we're going off in this direction. And pretty early on, I abandoned any idea that it would make logical sense.
Right.
And just kind of sat back and went, all right, you just do you, and I will laugh as much as I can and enjoy what I can out of this, because it was never going to be intellectually challenging, but damn, they really dropped all of that. Just let it all go in favor of like, we're just going to do whatever we want.
Yeah, I think we can talk more in depth about Tom Hardy's performance, though, because he is playing Eddie Brock and Venom, and you have these comical moments like when he is on the motorcycle being chased down by Drake's guys, and you have the symbiote trying to keep him alive and help him get away, but it's not in full form yet. We're not seeing the full suit during this. It's just sort of like squirting out various limbs from the symbiote and being like, okay, time to turn. We're going to latch onto this car and have you turn. And, that was kind of comical, with Eddie sort of figuring out what is going on and at the same time not having any clue what is going on. I think a lot of the facial expressions from Tom Hardy made his performance better, especially because we know for a fact that as an actor, he is not seeing these things happen. He just has to imagine them happening and hope that people believe his reaction and everything, because all of this is happening in post-production. So I think that's something that people don't think about too. You have to act without being able to see what you're acting against.
Yeah, and it's a very Tom Hardy style performance.
Yes.
In that he commits to the role, and he is willing to play it as he sees it, because Eddie Brock as a character is usually pretty macho, pretty masculine, and Tom Hardy just abandons all of that and goes for a almost vulnerable performance at times when he's dealing with Venom. And that was the part that I found fascinating, is watching him learn how to deal with this thing that's seeing his innermost emotions and all of that and portraying it on his face when, like you said, he has nothing to react against. He's the one doing the voice, and he did it post-production. So he's just coming up with these things while someone is probably shouting at him over the set, like, and he says this, blah, blah, blah. And yet Hardy is able to make it work and be the shining star of that movie, because even though the logic makes no sense, the things happening on screen are utterly ridiculous, I still believed his performance. I was like, okay, this is how this guy would act if he was faced with this ridiculous scenario. And that speaks very well of Hardy's skill set as an actor, I think.
Exactly. That sort of leads us right into the Venom and Eddie relationship, because that is so unique within the movie. And I feel like it's portrayed better than any of the other relationships between the characters, even between Eddie and Anne. It's like, okay, yeah, that was over in like 2 seconds. And obviously there's still lingering feelings between those two there, and it's just one of those things where, like I said, they kept kind of reminding you that Anne was Eddie's ex throughout the movie. At least that's what it felt like to me. So to have that contrasted with Eddie's relationship to Venom, it's such a stark difference, because Venom is literally in his head, but you know that Anne pretty much knows him almost as well as Venom does, without being able to literally get in his head. So it's one of those things where you're like, okay, and obviously with the symbiote, anything is possible, because if you're going into this and you've never read anything about Eddie Brock or Venom before, it's like, okay, you know, whatever they do with the symbiote, people will be able to believe that, because that's the really fictional aspect of this story. And just to have the conversations between Venom and Eddie that they wrote into this script and have them actually happen on the screen, it was like, okay, you know, this is where most of the comedy is going to come from. It's going to come from these two interacting with each other. And you even put down, you know, they have some romance vibes going on. So I will let you dive into that a little more.
Okay, so I was lucky enough to see this, and Lee Monson, who writes for Birth Movies Death, was at my screening, Lee, and immediately after we got out, and their review of Venom is 100% worth reading, they immediately talked about that this was the first gay buddy cop romance story they'd ever seen, superhero, and I was like, that is totally what was going on. Like, at one point, they kiss. Like, it's super weird and awkward, and if you look at it through that lens, all of a sudden, it honestly almost makes a little more sense. Like, at the end, they're talking about how they're going to have Anne as their girlfriend, and they're going to get her back, and very early on, it becomes apparent that Venom and Eddie kind of see themselves as a unit, and they're separate but together, and it's such a fascinating and hilarious look at the characters that it really fleshes out things between them, because it's so unintentional, utterly unintentional, but if you even give it the slightest bit of credence, it becomes obvious when you watch the whole thing. So I thought that had to be mentioned, because Tom Hardy is known as being a very flexible man in more than one way. And I was like, I really hope that he saw this and just dove right into it, because he's the kind of guy who would do that, from all the articles I've read with him and interviews and all that stuff. So I like that aspect of it, and it makes it more interesting and entertaining.
They also leave Anne in the dark at the end. You know, she thinks the symbiote is gone, but we know that Venom is certainly far from gone, and they're sort of keeping, you know, this little secret between themselves, and it'll be interesting to see, because I'm expecting there to be a sequel at some point. And I don't know if Michelle Williams is on board for multiple movies or what. I know Tom Hardy definitely is. So it'll be interesting to see if, you know, their goal is to get Anne back, how they go about doing that while still keeping the fact that Venom is around a secret, because I feel like that's something that could totally just ruin the relationship all over again.
Right. Well, with an $80 million opening weekend against A Star is Born, they're damn sure getting a sequel,
Yes.
especially with that end credit scene that sets up a sequel so perfectly. I think I'm interested to see what they do with this, as long as they stay as like balls out ridiculous, like we're gonna just do whatever and make it work. Then I'm down to watch it. But yeah, I don't know if Michelle Williams will stick around. I would imagine she would. She said that the thing that attracted her to this project was Tom Hardy,
Right.
getting the chance to work with him. So I could see her being like, whatever, this is a nice paycheck and probably not that much work for her. It's not like she's in a ton of scenes. So I'd be hopeful she'd come back.
Plus, you have the fact that, she could have more scenes in a sequel if their goal is to try and win her back. And, before we talk more broadly about improvements, the movie's success, and everything like that, I am glad you mentioned the end credit scene, because I totally forgot to put that in our notes here. But we definitely need to talk about that, because wow.
Yes. Wow is right. Oh, that wig, though.
That was
that
something.
Ronald McDonald wig.
That that's exactly what it looks like.
It is, dude. I saw it. I was like, oh, Woody, you just did this to wear that wig, didn't you? You just love being crazy. Like, oh, God. So bad. But it fits the movie.
Exactly what I was going to say. And it gives you that idea of, okay, we have seen Woody Harrelson in a wide variety of roles. He was in Solo, and you and I both discussed that. And he has a wide range for, what he can do as an actor, at least in my opinion, he does. And I think giving him the role of Cletus Cassidy, who is, spoiler alert for anyone who doesn't already know this, Carnage, another symbiote. So it's like, okay, we know you are going to show us quite a few of these symbiotes who have been big in the comics. Venom went up against Riot in this one, which was the one that attached itself to Carlton Drake. And, Riot didn't have a huge role in this by any means, but it's one of those things where they're diving into the lore quite a bit. And because of the fact that they have so many of these characters at their disposal, they can afford to use up a few pretty quickly. We probably won't see Riot again, I'm guessing, but I could be wrong on that. And I think the Venom and Carnage story is going to be a lot more interesting than it was with Venom and Riot. At least I hope so, because that was not great. Some of the CGI did not look great to me, and that's probably because I hate slow-mo, and they used it during the scene, and I was like, really? Why?
Yeah, I agree. Some of the, and I think a lot of that was due that you can tell this movie was meant to be rated R, and a lot of the stuff they cut out, especially during that final fight scene, I think is about that. But I think Woody Harrelson is a good pick for that, even if it's weird,
Right.
because he's really good at portraying, really out there crazy. I mean, Natural Born Killers is a great reference point for that, and I think he'll do a good job. He's another one who's like, whatever, I'm in a movie, I'm going to play it to the hilt. So I'll watch the second one 100%. And I think I'm interested to see them explore the Venom mythos. I don't have a whole lot of experience with it outside of Venom and Spider-Man's interaction. So I'm okay with seeing whatever they can bring to the screen in a hopefully more logical format. This movie would have definitely been improved with maybe a rewrite and pass over by one person with an idea of what the director wanted.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where you don't really know what you're going to get with a movie like this until you actually go and see it. And obviously, like you and I both said, there are people who enjoyed it a lot more than we did. And you even rated it a little higher than I did. And I think that's just because of my familiarity with the comics, especially the current Venom series, which I am absolutely loving right now. It just dives so deep into the history of the symbiotes that I was like, can I have this instead? So, I gave it a 2 out of 5. You gave it a 6 out of 10, which is 3 out of 5.
Oh,
So we're not too
I
far
double
apart.
checked. It's a 4 out of 10.
Okay, so we
like,
are on the same page. Scratch that.
Like, I know how bad it is. I enjoyed it because I love bad movies. Like, I have a deep and abiding passion for movies that are trying real hard to be good and yet fail so miserably because of these types of things, like plot holes and logic. But they have a couple of good perspectives to them. That's totally my jam. So, but I rated it reasonably in how good it actually is, which, like you said, 2 out of 5, 4 out of 10, that's where it's at. It is not a good movie by any means.
Yeah, so we are on the same page here, so that makes me feel a little better. I was like, was I being too harsh? And then I was like, no, I wasn't.
No, this is a movie, if you like bad movies, then it is so worth watching, preferably on, if you enjoy intoxicants, your preferred intoxicant, because, whoo, it's way more fun if you're, or I imagine at least, it would be way more fun if you're able to just be like, I don't even care. So.
And I feel like a lot of the general audience for most movies is sort of like that. They're like, I want to go, I want to have a good time. I don't really care about plot and all this stuff that, us critics care about. And you can really see that in, the critic score versus the audience score, I think, in this movie. And judging by how many more people were laughing than I was.
Right. I think it hits that sweet spot where critics see all the flaws and the audience doesn't see or doesn't care, and they're able to just enjoy it. And that's kind of that's what I took away from it. This is the kind of movie that I like to call big, stupid fun.
Yes.
I would say that Kong Skull Island falls into this realm as well. So it's just kind of, it's something that you just sit back and watch and don't care about what happens. You just enjoy the scene to scene interplay between the characters and the special effects and all that. So, but yeah, from an actual quality perspective, this isn't even like, this doesn't even meet Blade standards, if you will. Like, ooh.
Right. I want to spend quite a bit of time here going over things we thought they could have improved on and maybe how they could improve them. I always like looking at companies like DC and Marvel and being like, okay, what do I want from them as a fan? And, I don't try to be too critical when I'm doing things like that. It's like, I would love to see a Riri Williams Ironheart movie from Marvel and have her take over for Iron Man because Robert Downey Jr. can't play the character forever, and that's a logical jump to make for Marvel and stuff like that. So I think, with Venom, because of all of the plot holes, I think they literally could have done just a straight up Lethal Protector adaptation, and this movie would have been better. And I don't think, that would have necessarily given us quite the same story, which would be fine with me. Like I said, in Lethal Protector, you already have Eddie with the symbiote. So it's one of those things where he's coming from this place of disgrace in a different way. And he is already more familiar. The thing with the comic book movies is they really love their origin stories. And I get wanting to do that with Venom because, we haven't had a Venom movie. But when you're doing it with characters like Spider-Man and Batman for the 800th time, you're like, okay, if people want to know the origin stories, go watch the other movies. we don't need the origin story every single movie. So I do get why they did that, but I think they could have done it in a better way. We could have had, a quick clip of Eddie Brock in New York and him finding the symbiote, and maybe a newspaper clipping of Spider-Man catching the bad guy that Eddie Brock supposedly caught through his investigative journalism, who was the wrong guy, basically, and then cut to him being in San Francisco, 6 months later or whatever. They did a time jump in this because we see Anne with the new boyfriend and we're like, oh, okay, so that happened. And we don't need more information than that. It's like, okay, Anne has moved on. She has a new boyfriend, new job, whatever.
Right. I think the biggest thing they could have done to allow this story to be a more organic development and stick to the more classic storylines that Venom has already created with Marvel is to just rate it rated R. Like this movie was meant to be rated R. Like Deadpool. Like this is like Todd McFarlane created Venom for Christ's sake. Like you don't make a Todd McFarlane PG-13 movie. Like the man just doesn't do stuff like that. And I think I would have been so much more interested to see something that dove deeper into it and allowed Eddie Brock to be a more flawed human being, because he's flawed in this, but they never explore it. Like they never make him reckon with the fact that he almost destroyed his, ex-fiance's career. Like that's just kind of glossed over. Like, oh yeah, whatever. But he should have had to deal with that, and they never follow through on it. And I think rating it R would have given more of an opportunity to dive into those and allow him to be a more fully fleshed out character instead of like this mix. It's like this Eddie Brock Venom light almost that doesn't explore any of the more interesting aspects of Venom.
I totally agree. And it's just one of those things where it's like, yes, Tom Hardy nailed the performance, but because the story wasn't quite as good, it's like, he did what he could with what he was given. And I don't know how much this is something you cared about from just a visual aspect, but not having the big like spider on his chest, I was like, this looks kind of weird without it, because we're so used to seeing that, that white logo on Venom.
I did notice, and I actually read about this, is that they chose not to do that because Sony isn't sure if they can link it to the Marvel Universe yet. Like that's all still in flux. So they decided to just nix the whole thing because it's not technically part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even though they are really trying to get it to a point where they can bring Tom Holland's Spider-Man into the thing.
Yeah, but I feel like if you own the rights to the character, you own the rights to the character. I feel like that's a weird thing to nitpick over.
Right. Just embrace it and go with it. But I think that was the stated reason that I read in the released information, was that they were like, well, we're not technically linked, so we're not going to do it because we think it'll be confusing to audiences, which it's like, well, most people who see this movie are going to have at least a passing and
you still have to put Marvel at the front of the movie. It still says Marvel.
Right.
You're like, what?
And we can all Google. Like, come on now. And if you've watched the third Spider-Man movie, then Venom's origin story. That's more accurate to the Marvel universe anyway.
Right.
So I felt it was a weird and almost unnecessary omission. Like, why not just embrace who this character is? But it felt like they didn't want to. They didn't want to embrace more of the original timeline, the original stories and background. Instead, they opted to kind of half of old and half of new, and they smash it together in a way that's like, oh, you guys, you put the wrong parts together.
Yeah, it just felt so out of tune with the comics, I think. And obviously there are a lot of people out there who know way more about the Venom comics than I do. I've read, like I said, Lethal Protector, and then I'm currently loving the new series that just started this year with Donny Cates writing the story, and that really just dives into the history in a much better way, because even when the movie started, you're like, okay, where are we? What is going on? Space? Hi, okay. Crash?
Right?
Okay.
It just kind of starts, and here we are. I'm like, oh, okay.
And the movie did almost have a different opening, where they sort of went to the planet where the symbiotes were. And part of me kind of thinks that would have been better because, it adds this level of mystery with the way they had the opening. But then I feel like they never really do a good job of explaining it throughout the movie. It's like, we have these creatures basically, they're living. So you have these symbiotes that came from this place, and we never really learn much more than, Riot wants to go back and bring more back. Is like, go back where? What are we talking about? And
Right.
while I do know what they were talking about, I just felt like that was too vague for my liking. And because of how many things got cut, it seems like, Tom Hardy, I don't know if he was joking or not, but he was like, yeah, some of my favorite scenes were cut in an interview that he and Riz Ahmed did. And I was like, yeah, I don't think that's a thing you should be saying publicly right now, Tom Hardy. Might want to keep that to yourself.
He does what he wants.
True.
I totally agree. I think that it would have really given the story a little more gravitas, and like you would have known what the stakes are, because it doesn't establish the stakes until that pretty much until that final scene with Riot.
Yes.
Like the final fight scene, that's when you really realize what's going on here. I mean, it's mentioned before that, but it doesn't feel serious or necessarily important until we hit the point where we see Riot's going to do this, and we're certainly never given the idea that these beings are particularly menacing for the most part. I mean, they are when they find a match for their symbiosis, but 2 out of 4 of them die. So it kind of feels like, oh, well, they've got to find the right host, so it's not like they'll be able to come in and just murder us all, so I think it would have been better if they'd included that scene as well.
It was like all of a sudden they needed to stop Riot, and you're like, okay, great. Could we have a little more context than like one line?
Right, because it's tossed off and then, okay.
And then the movie's pretty much over.
Yep, and then we're done. And then we're sitting through credits that take 15 minutes to get to that final scene, and I was like, I don't know that this end credits, not the first one, but the second one.
Yeah, the Spider-Verse one.
Yeah, it's like, I don't think this was worth my time to sit here for 15 minutes. It was just so painful.
Yeah, those credits did seem very long. I was like, should I leave? Is this ever going to end? I mean, people left as soon as the movie ended, so some people don't even know about Carnage. I was like, what you guys doing? Why are you doing this?
Right. That I was like, okay, no, there's as soon as a superhero movie has like a flashy end credit scene, in particular, the one that's the most guilty of this I can think of is Black Panther.
Right.
They have that, they play through that song and they have this really flashy end credits, or this really flashy credit scene, and then it's this little bit afterwards, and then they cut to like the black rolling credits, and I was like, okay, now we're good. But whenever they have something flashy going on, oh, okay, there's an end credit scene. I better sit and wait for this. But yeah, I mean, Into the Spider-Verse looked interesting. I'm going to watch it, but
it comes out on my birthday, so I know what my plans are.
Nice. It took a long time to get there. Did you know Nicolas Cage is the noir Spider-Man?
Yes. Running a Spider-Man site helps with me knowing Spider-Man things.
Right. You know everything about Spider-Man.
I wouldn't say everything, but I do have to pay attention to the news more than most people need to.
Right.
But yeah, I just love that they're going to introduce Miles Morales, even though it's not a live action version, but that's a conversation for another day, because I do, before we go here, want to talk about what the movie's success means for Sony, because Sony, they're calling this their universe of Marvel characters. It's a really bad name. I just kind of forget that
God.
they call it that. And I'm like, no, it's your Spider-Man universe. Thank you. But anyway, it's pretty much confirmed that Morbius, the living vampire, is going to be the next character to get a solo movie. So we'll probably be seeing that before we see any Venom sequels or anything like that. And they cast Jared Leto as Morbius.
That's right. Oh.
And, this movie really depended on Venom's success, I think, because I don't know how many people are going to recognize the name Morbius off the street. Like, if you walk up to people who know about Spider-Man and know about Venom, they might not know about Morbius. I don't know much about Morbius, and I run a Spider-Man website. So I think
Yeah,
that sort of
same.
says a lot about that character, because the character doesn't really appear in too many things. I have a gist of who the character is, what the character can do, and everything like that. But beyond that, I don't know how interested I am in this character. I would have preferred if they did Black Cat or Silver Sable next, because that was what they were working on. You know, they were working on a movie with both of those characters in it, but they've now split them out to solo movies. They announced a Silk movie, which I think would be more interesting. Is like, can we have like some of the females here? Come on, guys.
Oh, I love Black Cat. I will totally go see without any kind of like ironic interest because I love her character.
It could be a total like combo between the Solo kind of heist movie and the Ocean's 8 kind of heist movie, and I would be totally fine with that.
Yep, 100%. I think this movie for Sony means a prolonging their career in movies, if you will. I know they're really suffering right now, and they needed this Venom
Right.
injection of cash and interest in what they've got to offer, and I think it will help them in the long run. But I think they're going to have to do better next time around. I don't think that a second Venom movie of this caliber is going to hold people's interest because it's fun to watch on a certain level, but it's not, it's not something you can go back to and be like, oh, look at this. It's not like Avengers Infinity War where you're watching it to see all of the interplay between all the characters and all of that stuff. This is you watch it and you're like, this is really dumb, you know?
I'm a little worried that if I rewatch this, I might think it's even worse. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, do I want to invest more time in this, or was once enough? And I'm glad we're podcasting on it so close to it coming out, because I was like, okay, I don't have to rewatch this. I saw it once. If I wait about a week to podcast on it, that's fine. We're good. Don't need to rewatch it.
Yeah, this is a movie that I will rewatch with friends to be like, dude, you guys have to watch this terrible movie. Let's get drunk and watch this. Because that's about the caliber it's at, where you pay attention during the silly, stupid scenes and that let the rest pass you by. Because it's an experience, but it's not something that's necessarily worth coming back to again and again. It's not either that bad or that good. It's not The Room or Infinity War. It exists in some place between those two that it's kind of like, well, it was entertaining, but it doesn't hold its own beyond that, I think.
The thing is, financially, I am glad it was successful, because that means, they might dump more money into things like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And because that's the next movie on the slate for them pretty much in this universe, I think it's different because it is animated. And obviously there are certain animated movies that do just fine. Hello, Incredibles 2, Coco was great. But I don't know if this is going to do as well as Venom did, but I don't think it has to, because you have a lot of big names in this movie. You probably have enough to attract people who might not have seen this because it's an animated movie. But you have Haley Steinfeld, you have Nicolas Cage, you have Jake Johnson in this as Peter Parker, which I think is fantastic. Just watching the trailers, it's something that I feel like, maybe within my nerd circles, people are more excited about this than they are for Venom. And I think that's just because a lot of us have a huge love for Miles Morales, and we're finally going to see him on the big screen, even though it's not a live action version.
Right. I think that it has the potential to be one of those animated superhero movies that breaks in, Teen Titans Go,
Yes.
I think, started that. But I think, they've been making these kinds of movies for a long time, and some of them are incredibly well reviewed. There's, what is that Batman one that's...
Mask of the Phantasm?
Yes, that
fantastic.
One was made a while
Wonderful.
ago. And yeah, exactly. And I think the Batman Year One, I've seen that one, and that one's really good. The Watchmen what do they call them? They're like animated comics or whatever, but it's essentially an animated show. Like, they've done some really great things with animated stuff, and it works so well combined with superheroes that I'm hoping that this will be the one that kind of breaks through that barrier and gets people to think about this as like, oh, this is totally worth spending my time and money to go see, in the same way that something like Venom, at least something like Venom, is worth going to go see, or even better, something like, one of the MCU films. Because I'll totally be taking my kid to go see that one because it looks so fun and so well crafted. Even just from that, I don't know, 5 minutes?
Yeah.
You can already tell that 5-minute bit is so much better crafted than the entirety of Venom. And that's saying something.
I'm very excited for Spider-Ham as well. So it's...
Yes, they have Spider-Ham.
And what they did visually with that is they have different sort of textures on the characters based on which universe they're from, which is so nuanced that I don't know if a lot of people are going to necessarily think too much about that. But it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, Sony Animation clearly has something going for them. And it'll be interesting to see if, those end up being characters that we see in live action movies down the line for Sony, because personally, getting Gwen Stacy as Spider-Gwen and Miles Morales as Spider-Man in the live action movies would be fantastic for Sony. I think, it won't be quite as big as Black Panther maybe, but I think a Miles Morales movie would have that potential.
Definitely. I would love to see that, especially because, even with the MCU, they've set it up just a tiny bit about Miles, and I think that character would be so fascinating. Like you said, it would be similar to how I would feel about having Shuri take over Iron Man's role, and I am 100% down for those kinds of...
That's also an option. I did not think about that. It's Riri Williams in the comics, but Shuri could easily do that in the MCU if they want to flip the script there.
That's right. I was thinking of a different one where Shuri does that. But she's, there's so many different options of ways to refresh this and make it more interesting to new viewers. Like, we don't just have to stick with comic book geeks. There's so many options, especially in the Spider-Man universe. Spider-Man is a very fluid character and always has been. So, and he has so many great villains and so much going on that, I would love to see more exploration done of that than just the little bits that we get from the MCU.
Yeah, I'm not saying that all of the comic book movies ever made need to follow comic books to the letter, but if you were going to list Lethal Protector as inspiration for a movie like Venom, it's like, okay, maybe just don't say that, because I didn't see too much of Lethal Protector in this other than Eddie Venom in the San Francisco setting. It's like, okay, that's fine, but if you are going to be like, oh yeah, we looked at Lethal Protector and this and that and the other thing, and we came up with our own story, that's one thing. But, it's interesting to compare how the Marvel Cinematic Universe has handled things like that, because Civil War in the movies is not the same as Civil War in the comics, and I think that's fine. And if Shuri took over for Tony Stark, I would not care. That's not what happens in the comics. It's just one of those things where you can create your own story, and that's something we see other universes doing. Castle Rock created its own story within the Stephen King universe, and I personally enjoyed that. I don't need everything to be a direct adaptation to find it enjoyable, but if you are going to cite certain comics and then have it not be like those comics, it's like, why bother in the first place? In my opinion, obviously.
Right. It's one thing to say that we were influenced by this, but, like, you got to be specific. And I agree. I'm 100% okay with them. I'd be okay with them sticking directly to the comic lore or going off. Like, there's so many more opportunities, especially since some comics are not, unadaptable.
Right.
Like Watchmen. There's a reason the Watchmen movie isn't the best, and it's not necessarily because Zack Snyder is, any of Zack Snyder's fault. Like, that comic is incredibly difficult to adapt. Like Sandman, good luck. Good luck. That's all I can wish upon whoever thinks they can adapt that into a reasonable movie. Some Comics can do things that other forms of media can't. And I am 100% okay and happy to see it when they push the boundaries of what comic book stories can do in movies, because they can do things that other forms of media can't.
Exactly. I think that is an excellent place to wrap this up. I know you and I probably could discuss various things that both Sony and Marvel could do with their characters for days, probably. But
Yes.
we will not subject the listeners to a 4-hour episode or something like that. But, I'm going to brainstorm maybe some bonus episodes here that aren't quite the same as, episodes like this, where maybe we get to explore things a little bit more instead of just talking about a movie or book or something like that. I will be in touch with you about that, I'm sure. But thank you so much for
That'll be
coming
lovely.
on to talk about Venom today, Katie. I had more fun talking about it than I did watching it, probably.
I was very excited to do this podcast with you. When you asked me, I was like, oh, hell yeah, I'm ready to discuss Venom with Deanna for as long as she wants to talk about it. So thank you for having me on. It was great.
Of course. And to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.